At my son's funeral, 3 little girls, strangers to me, whispered, "Bye, Daddy," at his grave. My only child, gone, and now this unthinkable secret. They saw me, their eyes wide with fear, and fled. My world fractured, but a quiet resolve settled within me. I had to know. Like this story, share it, and tell me where you're listening from. The phone rang on a Tuesday morning in March, slicing through the quiet hum of Eleanor Vance's perfectly ordered life. She remembered the precise time, 10:17 a.m., because the antique clock on her mantel chimed just as she picked up the receiver. The voice on the other end was professional, calm, yet its words struck her with the force of a physical blow. "Mrs. Vance, this is St. Jude's Hospital. We regret to inform you that your son, Daniel Vance, was involved in a car accident early this morning. He did not survive." The rest of the conversation blurred into a meaningless jumble of medical jargon and administrative details. 43 years old. Her Daniel, her only son, gone. The opulent living room, usually a sanctuary of comfort and elegance, suddenly felt vast and cold. 71 years old, a wealthy widow. Eleanor had faced loss before, but nothing had prepared her for this. The world outside, a crisp March morning promising spring, continued its oblivious turning, while hers had just ceased to exist. Grief was not merely sadness, it was a physical tearing, a void that threatened to swallow her whole. The millions in her bank account, the sprawling estate, the countless luxuries she had accumulated, all of it seemed utterly useless now, stripped of all meaning without Daniel to share it, without him even just knowing it was there. She thought of Daniel, her brilliant, compassionate son. A respected doctor, known for his dedication and tireless work ethic. Every Sunday, without fail, his call would come, a steady anchor in her week. Every Mother's Day, a magnificent bouquet of her favorite white lilies would arrive, accompanied by a card penned in his familiar, precise hand. He was her pride, her joy, her reason. His colleagues, like the somber Dr. Ramirez who visited her later that day, spoke of his unwavering commitment, the long hours he selflessly dedicated to his patients, his profound empathy. Listening to them, Eleanor felt a pang of something more than just grief. Was he lonely, despite all the lives he touched? Had his devotion to medicine left him with little room for a personal life, beyond his Sunday calls to her? She had never really considered it. Content in their familiar rhythm. The funeral was held at St. Mary's, the same venerable stone church where Daniel had been baptized as an infant. It was a sea of black, filled with an astonishing number of people whose lives Daniel had touched: patients, nurses, fellow doctors, distant relatives, and grateful families he had helped. Eleanor sat in the front pew, a figure of stoic sorrow, nodding vaguely at the condolences offered, her mind a fog of disbelief. The eulogies painted a picture of a man universally admired, a true healer. Each word added to the weight of her loss, a testament to the son she had loved beyond measure. At Greenwood Cemetery, the air was sharp and unforgiving. Eleanor watched, numb, as Daniel's mahogany casket was slowly, meticulously lowered into the freshly dug earth. It was a finality so absolute, so brutal, that she felt a physical snapping inside her, an irreparable break. Her heart, already shattered, splintered further. The murmurs of the crowd, the rustle of leaves in the sparse trees, the distant cry of a bird. It all coalesced into a backdrop of unbearable pain. As the last prayers were said, and the crowd began to disperse, leaving her alone in the chilling silence, Eleanor's gaze drifted towards an old, gnarled oak tree at the far edge of the plot. 3 small figures emerged from behind its ancient trunk. 3 girls. They were identical, about 10 or 11 years old, dressed in simple, yet formal, black dresses. Their hair, the color of midnight, fell neatly around their shoulders. They approached Daniel's grave with a quiet reverence, their small hands clutching single white daisies, their faces, pale with what looked like genuine, profound grief, were focused entirely on the mound of earth. Eleanor watched, a strange sense of bewilderment washing over her. Who were these children? She had never seen them before. As they reached the graveside, they knelt, placing their daisies gently on the fresh soil. Then, one of them, her voice barely a whisper, a sound that carried clearly in the stillness, spoke. "Bye, Daddy." The words struck Eleanor like a bolt of lightning, shattering the last vestiges of her composure. Daddy? Her mind reeled. Daniel had no children. She would know. She was his mother. He was her only son. He had never mentioned children, never married. The world, which had just begun to regain a semblance of order, now spun violently off its axis. The girls, startled by her sudden, involuntary gasp, looked up, their eyes, wide and fearful, met hers for a fleeting second before they scrambled to their feet and ran, disappearing as quickly as they had appeared. Back behind the ancient oak, Eleanor stood frozen, the whisper echoing in her ears. Had she imagined it? Was her grief finally playing tricks on her mind? Later that afternoon, back in her quiet, empty house, her neighbor, Miss Lee, stopped by with a casserole. Eleanor, still reeling, cautiously brought up the subject. "Miss Lee, did you happen to notice any children at the cemetery today?" "3 young girls." Miss Lee, practical and observant, frowned. "No, Eleanor. I can't say I did. Just the usual crowd." Miss Lee's casual denial only served to deepen Eleanor's torment, making her question her own sanity. But the image was too vivid, the words too clear. "Bye, Daddy." It was seared into her memory. She lay awake that night, haunted, unable to reconcile it with the Daniel she thought she knew. Had he kept a part of his life so completely hidden from her, his own mother? The thought was an icy hand clutching her heart. Despite the confusion, despite the terrifying self-doubt, a new, fierce resolve began to stir within her. She couldn't let it go. She needed answers. She would return to Greenwood Cemetery the next day. The earth that held her son now held a secret, and she was determined to unearth it. Eleanor spent the night in a torment of conflicting emotions. Sleep was a distant, unattainable luxury. Her mind replayed the scene at the cemetery countless times. The 3 identical girls, their black dresses, the white daisies, and that devastating whisper. "Bye, Daddy." Was she truly losing her grasp on reality? Or had her son, the man she thought she knew intimately, kept a monumental secret from her? The latter seemed unfathomable. Yet the image of those 3 small, grief-stricken faces was too vivid to dismiss as a figment of her imagination. A powerful, magnetic pull drew her back to Greenwood Cemetery the next morning, a desperate need for confirmation, for answers, for anything that might make sense of her fractured world. For an entire week, Eleanor drove to the cemetery every day. Ostensibly, she was visiting Daniel, sitting quietly by his fresh grave, placing fresh flowers, but secretly, her eyes scanned the grounds, particularly around the ancient oak tree, searching for the girls. Each day, she left disappointed, her hopes dwindling with every fruitless visit. The chill of early spring seemed to settle deeper into her bones, mirroring the icy dread in her heart. Perhaps Miss Lee was right. Perhaps it had been a hallucination. A cruel trick of her overwhelming grief. Then, on the following Wednesday, precisely a week after the funeral, her vigilance paid off. It was just past 10 a.m., a time when the cemetery was usually quiet, save for a few groundskeepers, and there they were, emerging from behind the same sprawling oak tree, just as before. 3 identical figures, but this time they were dressed in neat navy blue school uniforms, pleated skirts, crisp white blouses, and dark blazers. They moved with a quiet dignity that seemed far too mature for their apparent age. In their hands, instead of white daisies, they clutched bright red carnations, stark against their uniforms. Eleanor remained perfectly still, concealed by a large weeping willow near her son's grave. She watched as they approached Daniel's plot. Their heads bowed, they placed the red carnations meticulously on the grave, forming a small, vibrant line. Eleanor held her breath, every fiber of her being focused on their next move, her heart hammering against her ribs. The middle girl, her face solemn, spoke in a voice that was soft but clear. "We miss you, Daddy. Aunt Susan says you're in heaven now." Eleanor's breath hitched. Her heart, already a bruised and tender thing, seemed to stop altogether. It was real. They were real. At the sound of Eleanor's involuntary gasp, the girls looked up, their three identical pairs of eyes widening in surprise as they spotted her. The girl who had spoken, demonstrating a remarkable composure, took a hesitant step forward. Are you Daddy's mommy?" she asked, her voice tinged with a child's uncertainty, yet also a hint of brave curiosity. Eleanor could only nod, her throat tight with a sudden surge of emotion, a bewildering mix of profound sorrow, exhilarating hope, and a nascent, burning anger. Tears pricked at her eyes, hot and unexpected. "My name is Alice," the girl continued, her gaze unwavering. She gestured to her sisters. "These are Clara and Lucy. We're triplets." Then, with a simple, devastating directness, she added, "We were Daddy's daughters." Eleanor finally found her voice, though it was barely a whisper. Daughters? As she looked at them properly now, truly seeing them, it was undeniable, the way their brows furrowed when they concentrated, the subtle curve of their lips, the intelligent spark in their eyes. They were Daniel's. She saw him in their delicate features, in their quiet intensity. It was an overwhelming realization, a posthumous gift from a son she thought she knew completely. Alice, with the air of the eldest, though they were all the same age, provided more details. "We're 10, we'll be 11 in September." This meant Daniel would have been 33 when they were born. A full decade of his life, a decade of her grandchildren's lives, had unfolded without her knowledge. "Where do you live?" "Who is Aunt Susan?" Eleanor asked, her voice cracking. "We live with Aunt Susan," Alice explained, pointing vaguely towards the distant cityscape. "She's at work now, cleaning offices downtown." Clara chimed in. "We skipped school today. Aunt Susan told us not to come because it's too sad, but we had to see Daddy." The words sent a whirlwind of conflicting emotions through Eleanor. Joy for the existence of these beautiful girls, her grandchildren. Confusion at Daniel's elaborate secrecy, anger at the years stolen from them all, and a fresh wave of heartbreak, knowing Daniel was gone, leaving this profound mystery unsolved, and these children without their father. "Does Aunt Susan know you're here today?" Eleanor asked again, needing to understand the full scope of this hidden life. Alice shook her head. "No. She would be mad. She says it's too sad to visit, but we had to say goodbye," Clara added, her lower lip trembling slightly. "We didn't get to before he went to heaven." Lucy, who had been quieter, now spoke up, her voice small. "Daddy was supposed to visit us this weekend, but then Aunt Susan got a phone call, and she cried, and she said Daddy had an accident." Eleanor felt a sickening lurch as the pieces clicked into place. That Saturday, the weekend before his death, Daniel had called her, unusually apologetic, to cancel their regular Sunday dinner. He had cited an unexpected emergency at the hospital, an unavoidable patient situation. Now, she understood. He had canceled on her to be with them. The girls began to share their memories of Daniel, painting a vibrant, if fragmented, picture of his secret life. He visited them every other weekend, a consistent, loving presence. He taught them to ride their bikes in the park, patiently guided their small hands to make the fluffiest pancakes on Saturday mornings, read them bedtime stories with different voices, and always brought them small, thoughtful presents. He was their daddy. Eleanor's tears, which had been threatening to spill, now flowed freely, hot tracks down her cheeks. The depth of Daniel's love for these children, and their unshakable love for him, was palpable. He had built a whole life, a whole family, in parallel to the one she knew. "Why?" Eleanor finally managed to ask, the word choked with emotion. "Why didn't he ever bring you to meet me?" Alice looked at her with solemn, serious eyes, her expression mirroring a maturity beyond her years. "Daddy said you were still very sad about Grandpa Robert dying, and he didn't want to make you sadder." Clara, always the one to add detail, earnestly elaborated. "He said you were the best mommy, and he loved you very much. He said we would meet you when the time was right, when you weren't so sad anymore." Eleanor wept openly now, her shoulders shaking. Her husband, Robert, had died 15 years ago, a loss that had indeed plunged her into a deep grief, one she had slowly, meticulously built a life around. But Daniel, her kind, thoughtful son, had carried that burden for her, shielding her from what he perceived as further heartache, believing he was protecting her. Instead, he had protected her from a decade of joy, from the love of her own grandchildren. And now, he was gone, leaving them all in this bewildering, sorrowful state. She had lost a son and gained 3 grandchildren. But the architect of this new reality was no longer there to explain. Alice, sensing Eleanor's profound distress, awkwardly reached out a small hand and gently patted Eleanor's arm. "Daddy said, sometimes grown-ups have to make hard choices to protect the people they love," she whispered, her voice surprisingly wise. The raw, profound grief that had enveloped Eleanor as she listened to her newfound granddaughters speak of their father was abruptly shattered by a sharp, agitated voice. "Alice, Clara, Lucy, what are you doing here?" A woman, thin and wiry, with a strained expression that mixed panic with a burgeoning anger, hurried towards them from the direction of the cemetery entrance. She was in her late 50s, her hair pulled back in a severe bun, wearing practical, worn clothing. This had to be Aunt Susan. Her eyes, sharp and scrutinizing, immediately swept over the 3 girls, checking them for any signs of distress before landing squarely on Eleanor. "You skipped school," Aunt Susan scolded, her voice tight with exasperation. "Do you have any idea how worried I was when the school called? I told you not to come here. It's too upsetting." She then turned her gaze to Eleanor, her expression hardening into a suspicious stare. "And who are you?" Eleanor, still reeling from the intimate conversation with the girls, struggled to compose herself. "I'm Eleanor Vance," she corrected, her voice still a little hoarse from weeping, "Daniel's mother." The effect of her words was immediate and dramatic. Aunt Susan's already pale face drained of all color, becoming a mask of shock and alarm. Her eyes darted from Eleanor to the girls, then back to Eleanor, her mind clearly racing, piecing together the fragments of the scene she had just stumbled upon. The brief moment of vulnerability in her face was quickly replaced by a fierce, protective resolve. "Come on, girls, we need to get you back to school," Aunt Susan said, her voice firmer now, as she reached out and pulled Alice's hand with a surprising force. She gathered Clara and Lucy close, forming a tight, defensive huddle with the children. "Please, wait," Eleanor pleaded, stepping forward, desperation lacing her voice. "I just found out about them. I need to understand. I need to know why Daniel kept them a secret from me." "Who are you to them?" Aunt Susan met her gaze, her eyes narrowed. "No," she stated, her voice cold and unyielding. "You have no rights here. Daniel made his choices for good reasons. He protected them. And he protected you." She tugged harder on the girls' hands, ushering them away from Daniel's grave, away from Eleanor. Eleanor watched, helpless, as the woman practically dragged her granddaughters towards the cemetery gate. The girls, though compliant, kept glancing back at Eleanor, their faces a mixture of confusion and regret. As they reached an old, dented blue sedan parked on the gravel path, Alice, the bravest of the 3, managed to turn her head and call out, her young voice carrying faintly on the breeze, "Will we see you again?" Eleanor tried to answer, but the words caught in her throat. Before she could utter a sound, Aunt Susan bundled the girls into the back seat, got behind the wheel, and started the engine. With a sputter and a cloud of exhaust, the old car pulled away, disappearing down the winding cemetery road, leaving Eleanor standing utterly alone by Daniel's grave, once again surrounded by an agonizing silence. The questions that had begun to coalesce in her mind now swirled into a maelstrom of confusion and raw hurt. Daniel had daughters, 3 of them, 10 years old. They lived with this Aunt Susan, a woman who seemed terrified by Eleanor's discovery. A woman who explicitly stated Eleanor had no rights. That night, back in her grand, empty house, the silence was deafening. Eleanor tried to piece together the fragments of information. Daniel's excuse, relayed by Alice, that he had wanted to protect her from sadness after Robert's death, now felt flimsy, almost insulting. Grandchildren, her own flesh and blood, could never be a source of sadness. They would have been a balm, a renewed purpose, a continuation of the family line that now felt so tragically cut short. Why would Daniel believe such a thing? What kind of profound sadness could the birth of 3 healthy, beautiful girls bring? And then, there were Alice's wise, almost world-weary words. Daddy said sometimes grown-ups have to make hard choices to protect the people they love. What hard choices? What protection? Was it protection from her, Eleanor? Or from something else entirely? The mystery deepened with every attempt to understand, pulling her further into a labyrinth of unspoken truths and hidden lives. One thing, however, stood out with crystalline clarity amidst the emotional chaos. Regardless of Daniel's reasons, regardless of Aunt Susan's objections, Eleanor could not, would not, pretend these girls didn't exist. They were her granddaughters. They were Daniel's legacy. They were the only remaining piece of her son, her only remaining family, in a world that suddenly felt vast and isolating. A fierce, protective instinct, one she hadn't felt since Daniel was a small boy, ignited within her. The quiet, dignified widow was gone, replaced by a woman consumed by a singular purpose. She was determined. She would find the truth. She would understand why Daniel had kept this secret. And she would, no matter what obstacles Aunt Susan placed in her path, become a part of her granddaughters' lives. They were her family. And she would not lose them too. This was not merely about curiosity. It was about reclaiming a future, about honoring Daniel's memory, and about embracing the unexpected gifts he had left behind. The abrupt departure of Aunt Susan and the girls left Eleanor with a stark emptiness, the tantalizing glimpse of her family replaced by an infuriating void. For 3 days, she drove aimlessly through the city, her gaze relentlessly sweeping every street, every parking lot, every quiet cul-de-sac, in a futile search for Aunt Susan's distinctive old blue sedan. It was a desperate, Sisyphean task, yielding nothing but frustration and a deepening sense of helplessness. On Saturday morning, a flicker of inspiration struck. Daniel's apartment. He had lived in the same, modest, centrally located building for years, a place he always described as convenient for the hospital. Perhaps the building manager, Mr. Sanchez, a kindly, observant man Eleanor remembered from occasional visits, might have some information. Mr. Sanchez, initially wary when Eleanor inquired about visitors, eventually warmed to her sincere distress. "Mrs. Vance, I am so sorry for your loss." Daniel was a good man, a quiet man. Eleanor explained her predicament carefully, omitting the more dramatic details, simply stating she was trying to piece together aspects of Daniel's life. Did he ever have regular visitors? Mr. Sanchez, perhaps an older woman with children? Mr. Sanchez pondered for a moment, then nodded slowly. "Yes, now that you mention it. 3 polite, quiet little girls. They came sometimes, usually on weekends, with an older woman. In her 50s, I'd say. Always looked a bit tired, like she was carrying a heavy load." Eleanor felt a thrill of confirmation. That's her. Aunt Susan. The pieces of the puzzle, though still scattered, were beginning to take shape. She thanked Mr. Sanchez profusely, a renewed sense of purpose invigorating her. That afternoon, Eleanor returned to the cemetery. Instead of approaching Daniel's grave directly, she parked discreetly a little distance away, behind a cluster of hedges, her powerful car blending into the background. She settled in, prepared to wait. A quiet vigil in the hope that her granddaughters, in their innocent devotion, would return. After 2 long hours, just as the afternoon sun began to dip, she saw it. The old blue sedan, sputtering into the cemetery. Aunt Susan and the 3 girls emerged. This time, they were dressed in simple weekend clothes, perhaps having come directly from errands or a visit to a park. They carried no flowers, only their quiet solemnity as they approached Daniel's grave. Eleanor waited until they were gathered, then emerged from her car, walking slowly and deliberately towards them. Aunt Susan tensed, her shoulders tightening, her eyes instantly wary, but Eleanor offered a small, gentle smile. "Hello, again," she said softly, her voice calm. "I was just visiting my son." Alice, Clara, and Lucy looked at her with a mixture of curiosity and the lingering wariness that Aunt Susan had instilled. Lucy, the youngest in spirit, even in her identical triplet form, shyly held up a small, vibrant bouquet of wildflowers. We picked these for Daddy, she murmured, her voice soft. Eleanor's heart swelled. They're beautiful, dear. I'm sure he would have loved them. She met Aunt Susan's gaze, observing the lines of exhaustion etched around her eyes, the weary resignation in her posture. Susan, Eleanor began, her voice earnest. Could we please talk? Just for a little while? I'm not trying to cause trouble. I need to understand. Aunt Susan hesitated, her gaze flicking between Eleanor and the girls. The protective shell around her seemed to waver, perhaps worn down by the sheer weight of her responsibilities. It was Alice who, once again, broke the stalemate. Aunt Susan, she said, her voice clear and firm for a child. Maybe we should talk to her. Daddy always said she was nice. A long, drawn-out sigh escaped Aunt Susan. She looked utterly defeated, but nodded. All right, she conceded, her voice flat. But it doesn't mean anything has changed. O'Malley's diner on Maple Street. In an hour, Eleanor watched them drive away, a glimmer of hope rekindled in her chest. An hour later, Eleanor found herself seated in a booth at O'Malley's diner, a quaint, slightly worn establishment with checkered floors and the comforting aroma of coffee and grilled food. Aunt Susan and the girls arrived, settling opposite her. The girls, their initial shyness fading slightly, were soon happily engrossed in sharing a plate of fries and sipping thick milkshakes, granting the adults a semblance of privacy. So, Eleanor began, choosing her words carefully. Tell me about Daniel and the girls. About their mother. Aunt Susan looked down at her hands, clasped tightly on the formica table. Their mother was my sister, Abigail, she explained, her voice low. She died almost 4 years ago. The girls were 6. Eleanor's heart ached for them. Another mother lost too soon. Abigail had health problems, Aunt Susan continued, her gaze still fixed on her hands. Daniel, he was a good man. He helped her. After she passed, there was nobody else. I took them in. Health problems? Eleanor pressed gently, sensing there was more to this story. A deeper layer of Daniel's secrecy. Aunt Susan finally looked up, her eyes guarded. Some things are private, Mrs. Vance. Then, her tone sharpened, a protective edge returning. Look, I need to be clear. Daniel never married Abigail. He supported them. He loved them. He was their father in every way that mattered. But legally, you have no rights here. The words stung, a painful reminder of her late discovery, but Eleanor understood the fear behind them. This woman, exhausted and burdened, was simply trying to protect the children she had raised. Eleanor softened her voice, letting her own vulnerability show. Susan, I'm 71 years old. Daniel was my only child. These girls, they are my only remaining family. I'm not here to take them away. I just want to understand, and perhaps, if you'd allow it, to be a part of their lives. Aunt Susan's shoulders sagged, a deep weariness finally overtaking her defenses. Her eyes, now glistening with unshed tears, met Eleanor's. Abigail, she began, her voice barely a whisper. She had a rare, hereditary genetic condition. It affects the muscles, makes them weak over time. Progressive. Eleanor felt a sickening lurch in her stomach, a cold dread creeping up her spine. The girls? She asked, her voice tight with terror. Do they have it? Aunt Susan nodded, tears finally spilling down her cheeks. 2 of them, Clara and Lucy. It's already starting to show sometimes. Alice, she looked over at the girl, who was happily dipping a fry into ketchup, oblivious to the gravity of the conversation. Alice seems clear. But we won't know for sure until she's older. Daniel. Daniel was a doctor. He knew what it meant. He knew the future they faced. Eleanor felt the world tilt. Her granddaughters, 2 of them, facing a future of progressive muscle weakness. This was the sadness Daniel had wanted to protect her from. This was the hard choice. It was a devastation far greater than she could have imagined. The revelation hit Eleanor with the force of a physical blow, leaving her breathless. Her mind, usually so sharp and analytical, struggled to process the devastating news. My granddaughters, facing progressive muscle weakness. This hidden truth explained Daniel's silence, his protection. It was a burden he had carried alone, shielding her from what he perceived as further heartbreak. Keep watching to see how this story unfolds. Like and share, and don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss a single part of this journey. How severe is it, Susan? Eleanor managed to ask, her voice barely a whisper, a trembling hand reaching across the table towards the aunt. Aunt Susan, her own tears still silently tracking down her worn cheeks, took a moment to compose herself. It's manageable, she began, with a lot of care. Physical therapy, twice a week, special medications, regular checkups with specialists, monitoring. It's expensive. Mrs. Vance. She paused, her gaze distant, as if reliving past struggles. Daniel. He was wonderful. He helped with all the medical costs. He always made sure they had the best doctors. But now, her voice trailed off, a fresh wave of grief for Daniel washing over her. Now, it's just me. I work night cleaning jobs so I can be available for their daytime appointments. Eleanor watched the girls, lost in their world of fries and milkshakes. Alice, with an almost imperceptible gesture, cut a particularly large piece of hamburger for Lucy, who seemed to struggle slightly with the fork. Clara, ever watchful, quietly nudged a napkin closer to Lucy's hand when a drop of milkshake spilled. It was a heartbreakingly natural, practiced team effort, a testament to the daily realities of their lives. Is that why he kept them secret from me? Eleanor asked again, the question heavy with a pain that went beyond mere curiosity. Because of their condition? Aunt Susan nodded slowly, her eyes meeting Eleanor's, filled with a shared sorrow and the weariness of too many battles fought alone. He said, "You'd been through enough sadness with your husband, Robert. He didn't want you to worry about sick grandchildren. He truly believed he was protecting you, Mrs. Vance." A flash of sharp anger momentarily flared in Eleanor. How could Daniel have thought her so fragile, so incapable of love and support, to deny her the joy of grandchildren, to bear such a profound burden alone, all in the name of a misguided protection? But the anger quickly dissolved, replaced by a profound understanding of Daniel's immense, selfless love, and the crushing weight Aunt Susan had been carrying for years. "Tell me," Eleanor said, her voice now firm with resolve, "exactly what kind of care they need. The appointments, the medications, everything." Aunt Susan, surprised by Eleanor's directness, detailed the rigorous routine. Twice weekly physical therapy sessions, requiring specialized equipment and skilled therapists. Monthly visits to their neurologist. The careful balance of medication to manage symptoms. The constant vigilance required to ensure they didn't overexert themselves, yet still engaged in activities to maintain muscle strength. It was a full-time job in itself, a relentless cycle of care and concern. "What if," Eleanor proposed, her voice soft but steady, "you didn't have to do it alone anymore? What if I could help? With the costs, with the appointments, with everything?" Aunt Susan's eyes narrowed, a flicker of suspicion returning. "Are you just trying to throw money at the problem, Mrs. Vance?" she asked, her tone a little defensive. "No," Eleanor interjected, shaking her head emphatically. "I'm talking about family. About these girls having a grandmother who loves them. About you having support, someone to share the load. Someone who wants to be there for them." Alice, who had been quietly listening to the adult conversation with an intensity that belied her age, spoke up again. "Aunt Susan," she said, her voice quiet but firm, "maybe we should talk to her. Daddy always said she was nice." Then, Alice slid out of the booth and approached Eleanor, her small hand reaching out and gently touching Eleanor's arm. Her identical sisters, Clara and Lucy, watched intently. "Are you really our grandmom?" Alice asked, her innocent eyes searching Eleanor's face. "And you want to know us, even though Clara and Lucy are sick?" Eleanor felt a wave of emotion so powerful it threatened to overwhelm her. Tears welled in her eyes. But this time they were not purely of grief or sorrow, but of an overwhelming, fierce love. She reached out and tenderly clasped Alice's hand. "Yes, sweetheart," she affirmed, her voice choked with emotion. I really am your grandmom. And yes, I want to know all of you. Especially because Clara and Lucy are sick. That's what families do. We take care of each other. No matter what. Alice nodded, a small, knowing smile gracing her lips. I think Daddy would like that. From across the table, Aunt Susan let out a shaky breath, finally allowing her own tears to fall freely. The weight of years of solitary struggle, of Daniel's secret, of her own fierce protection, seemed to lift, if only slightly. It's all happening very fast, Aunt Susan whispered, her voice raw with emotion. I understand, Eleanor replied, her gaze unwavering. We can take our time, step by step. But please, Susan, don't shut me out. Don't let me lose them too. Aunt Susan was quiet for a long moment, her eyes moving between Eleanor and the three girls, who had now come to stand beside their sister. Finally, she nodded, her shoulders still slumped with weariness, but with a new, hesitant acceptance in her eyes. All right, she said, her voice stronger. But on my terms. The girls need to get to know you. You need to understand what this commitment truly means. And you can't walk away if it gets too much, if it's too hard. I won't walk away, Eleanor promised, her voice filled with a conviction that left no room for doubt. These are my granddaughters, Daniel's daughters. Nothing about their condition changes that. In fact, it only makes me more determined to be here. Aunt Susan, still clearly scared, but seeing the genuine sincerity in Eleanor's eyes, finally offered a small, tentative smile. Okay, she said. We'll try. But my pace, and the girls' needs always come first. For the first time since Daniel's death, since that fateful phone call, Eleanor felt a profound stirring of hope. The emptiness that had threatened to consume her began to recede. She had found a new purpose, a new reason to live, a family to fight for. The following Saturday, Eleanor found herself standing on the porch of Aunt Susan's small, modest bungalow. A tiny house, certainly, but neat as a pin, with a cheerful red door, her heart hammered with a mixture of anticipation and nerves. She, Eleanor Vance, mistress of a sprawling estate, was about to enter a world utterly new to her. The door opened, revealing Aunt Susan, who looked equally nervous, her usually severe features softened by a flicker of apprehension. Come in, Mrs. Vance, she said, her voice a little strained. Eleanor stepped inside. The house was small, yes, but undeniably a home. A colorful jumble of children's artwork adorned the refrigerator, school backpacks lay neatly by the door, and the faint scent of fresh-baked cookies hung in the air. It was spotless, clearly tended with meticulous care and love. Alice appeared first, her face open and curious, followed closely by Clara and Lucy, who clung slightly to their sister, peering out shyly. Eleanor felt a surge of awkwardness, unsure how to bridge the chasm of 10 years of missed connection. It was Alice who, with her characteristic confidence, broke the ice. Hello, Grandma Eleanor, she said, her voice clear. The title, Grandma Eleanor, landed in Eleanor's chest like a warm, surprising balm, making her heart skip with a joyous, painful beat. Lucy, emboldened by Alice's bravery, piped up. We made cookies. Chocolate chip. Aunt Susan helped. She gestured proudly towards a plate on the small coffee table. They settled onto the worn but comfortable couch. Alice, without hesitation, sat on one side of Eleanor, while Clara, after a moment's hesitation, settled on the other. Lucy chose a floral armchair opposite them, clutching a worn teddy bear. Aunt Susan perched on the edge of another armchair, her gaze watchful. Clara, her shyness still apparent, reached for something on the coffee table. It was a small, homemade book, crafted from construction paper. Crudely stapled together. It's about our family, she mumbled, presenting it to Eleanor. Eleanor carefully opened the book. Inside, crayon drawings depicted their world. A tall figure with a friendly smile labeled Daddy, surrounded by 3 smaller figures with matching braids. Pictures of the girls at around age 7, alongside a smiling mommy, Abigail. Eleanor noticed that Abigail's figure later disappeared from the drawings, replaced by Aunt Susan, who was depicted teaching them, reading to them, pushing them on swings. And Daniel was always there, teaching them, reading stories, pushing them on swings, a constant, loving presence. Daddy said you lived far away, Lucy recalled, her voice dreamy. But that someday we might meet you. Eleanor felt a pang of profound sadness. Sweetheart, she said gently, her voice thick with emotion. I didn't live far away. I didn't know about you, and I wish I had been part of all those wonderful times with your daddy. As she spoke, Clara leaned against her, her small head resting on Eleanor's arm. Eleanor noticed how slight Clara was, how easily she seemed to tire. A heartbreaking confirmation of Aunt Susan's words. Alice, always the most direct, looked at Eleanor with her serious gaze. Are you really rich? She asked. Without preamble, Eleanor chuckled softly, a genuine sound. Yes, Alice, I suppose I am. But with wealth comes responsibility, a responsibility to help those in need, to make the world a little better. Just like how you girls take care of each other. For the next hour, they sat and talked, looking through worn photo albums that chronicled the girls' lives. Daniel was in many of the pictures, a younger, more relaxed version of the serious Dr. Eleanor knew. He was laughing, playful, unguarded, a loving father to his 3 identical daughters. It was a revelation, a window into a part of her son's life she had never known existed. Daddy said he loved us as much as all the stars in the sky, Lucy whispered, pointing at a picture of Daniel holding all 3 girls, their faces turned up towards a starry night sky. Eleanor observed Clara and Lucy throughout the visit. Their movements were sometimes less coordinated than Alice's, their energy levels visibly lower. Alice, in turn, subtly supported them, a quiet hand on a sister's back, a gentle redirection of a toy. It was a dance of care, so ingrained it was almost invisible. Eventually, Lucy, completely exhausted, curled up in Eleanor's lap without asking, her small body instinctively seeking comfort. Eleanor gently stroked her soft hair, the warmth of the child a profound comfort. Grandma Eleanor, will you tell us a story? Clara asked, her eyes still on the photo album. Eleanor, tears pricking her eyes, nodded. She began to share memories of Daniel's childhood. His fascination with collecting bugs, the time he tried to give the cat a bath and ended up soaked, his determined efforts to learn to cook a surprise meal for her, his unwavering ambition to become a doctor. As she spoke, her voice filled with love and longing, Lucy drifted off to sleep in her lap. She naps most afternoons, Aunt Susan explained softly, observing Eleanor. Because of her condition, Eleanor carefully carried the sleeping Lucy to the small, shared bedroom, laying her gently on the lower bunk of a brightly painted bed. Back in the living room, Alice and Clara had another request. Can we show you some videos? Alice asked, her eyes bright. Aunt Susan retrieved a tablet from a drawer. On the screen, Daniel's familiar face appeared. Younger, vibrant, he was telling an elaborate fairy tale, his voice playfully changing for each character, making silly faces that were utterly unlike the composed Dr. Eleanor knew. At the end, his expression turned serious. Be good for Aunt Susan, he said directly to the camera, his eyes filled with love. Take care of each other. Eleanor felt the tears well up again, the raw grief for her son resurfacing, but this time mingled with an overwhelming sense of gratitude and love. He had loved them so fiercely. He made them for when we missed him, Alice explained, her voice quiet. Aunt Susan, less guarded now, finally allowed herself to speak from the heart. This is hard, Mrs. Vance, she admitted, her voice trembling. They've been my whole world for so long. I'm scared of sharing them, of what might happen. I don't want to take them away, Susan, Eleanor reiterated, her voice gentle but firm. I want to help. With the upcoming medical appointments, the insurance battles, the costs, all of it. Alice, ever the serious one, looked at her aunt. Aunt Susan, she said, her voice remarkably mature. Maybe it would be good to have help. You've been really tired lately. Clara nodded, adding, maybe Grandma Eleanor could help make things easier. Eleanor, seeing the profound need in the girls' faces, and the sheer exhaustion in Aunt Susan's, knew this was her moment. We can start small, she suggested, Let me help with the next round of appointments. Just let me be there. Aunt Susan looked at the girls, then back at Eleanor. In her eyes, Eleanor saw a complex mix of hope and lingering fear. Finally, she nodded. Okay, she whispered. We'll try. As Eleanor prepared to leave, a sleepy Lucy, just waking, tottered out of the bedroom and hugged her goodbye, her small arms surprisingly strong. And as Eleanor walked out the door, Alice, with a mischievous smile, discreetly slipped a piece of paper into her hand. On it was written a phone number. Driving home, Eleanor reflected on the day, the instant, natural bond with her granddaughters, the revelation of Daniel's hidden love, his secret life, the weight of his burden, and her new purpose, burning bright within her. That night, she called the number Alice had given her, marking the true beginning of a new chapter, a new family. 3 weeks had passed since Eleanor's first visit to Aunt Susan's bungalow, weeks that had transformed her life. She accompanied Clara and Lucy to their physical therapy sessions, observing the careful, repetitive movements, the quiet determination in their young faces. She learned the names of their medications, memorized their dosages, and spent countless hours researching muscular dystrophy, its various forms, its prognoses, its latest treatments. She was learning to be a grandmother, a caregiver, a fighter. During a routine checkup with their neurologist, Dr. Miller, Eleanor sat beside Aunt Susan, the two women, a united front in the small, clinical room. Clara and Lucy sat on the examination table, their legs dangling, cheerfully coloring in a shared book, seemingly oblivious to the gravity of the adults' conversation. Alice, however, sat quietly in a chair nearby, her eyes darting between Dr. Miller and the two older women, listening with an intensity that belied her years. Dr. Miller, a kind-faced woman with serious eyes, cleared her throat. "We've received the full genetic test results for Clara and Lucy," she began, her tone gentle but firm. "While we knew they carried the genetic markers, there's something else we need to discuss. The progression of their condition appears to be more aggressive than initially thought." Eleanor felt a cold dread creep into her bones, her breath catching in her throat. "What does that mean, Dr. Miller?" she asked, her voice raspy. Without intervention, Dr. Miller explained. Her gaze meeting Eleanor's, both Clara and Lucy may experience significant mobility issues within a few years. Walking could become extremely difficult, if not impossible. Eleanor struggled to breathe. "Intervention? What kind of intervention?" Dr. Miller then explained. "There's an experimental treatment program at Johns Hopkins. It's cutting edge, showing incredibly promising results in halting the progression of this specific variant. It's intensive, requiring a several-month-long stay at the hospital, followed by extensive outpatient rehabilitation. Months?" Aunt Susan whispered, her voice a broken sound. I don't have the resources for something like that." Dr. Miller nodded sympathetically. "The program itself covers the medical costs, the treatments, which are substantial, but it doesn't cover living expenses for a prolonged stay, lost wages for a caregiver, or the logistics of relocating your family for such a period." Eleanor glanced at Clara and Lucy, still absorbed in their coloring, their bright crayons dancing across the page. But Alice, her small face now pale, was no longer coloring. She was listening, every word absorbed. "And without treatment?" Eleanor pressed, needing to know the full, terrible truth. Dr. Miller hesitated, then delivered the grim prognosis. "Without intervention, it's highly likely they'll need wheelchairs within 5 years, and unfortunately, with this aggressive form, their life expectancy would be significantly shortened." Aunt Susan let out a strangled cry, a sound of pure despair. Eleanor reached for her hand, gripping it tightly, her own trembling. "With treatment, Dr. Miller continued, a glimmer of hope in her voice, "we've seen marked improvement. The goal is to halt the progression, to give them decades of additional mobility and independence." Alice, who could no longer contain her anxiety, spoke up. "Are you talking about Clara and Lucy?" Dr. Miller nodded, her expression regretful. "Yes, sweetie, we are." "Would they have to go away?" Alice asked, her small voice thick with fear. "For a while, yes," Dr. Miller confirmed. but not alone. Someone would need to be with them full time. Alice turned to Aunt Susan, her honesty brutal. Aunt Susan can't leave work. And we can't afford it anyway. I heard you on the phone with the insurance company. Clara, hearing snippets of the conversation, looked up from her coloring book, her eyes wide with sudden comprehension. Are Alice and I going to get sicker? She asked, then quickly corrected herself. No, you and Lucy. Right? Are you going to get sicker? Alice's eyes, full of tears, silently confirmed her sister's worst fears. Not if I have anything to say about it, Eleanor declared, her voice firm, resolute. Eleanor, don't make promises you can't keep, Aunt Susan warned, her own voice shaky. This is a significant commitment, Mrs. Vance. Dr. Miller cautioned, echoing Aunt Susan's concern. 6 to 8 months, possibly longer. It's beyond just the financial aspect. It's 24/7 care, emotional support, managing expectations, dealing with setbacks. These are my granddaughters, Eleanor said, looking directly at Aunt Susan, her eyes filled with an unwavering resolve. If there's a treatment that could help them, then we're going to do it. You don't understand the demands, Aunt Susan argued, her voice rising in desperation. The constant care, the emotional toll, the logistics of leaving our lives here. Then come with us, Eleanor proposed, the words simple, powerful. All of us. We'll rent a place near the hospital. I'll hire the best home care nurses, tutors, whatever they need. I have the means, Susan. Let me help. Aunt Susan stared at her, overwhelmed, unable to fully comprehend or accept the magnitude of Eleanor's offer. I'm choosing to do it, Susan, Eleanor insisted, her voice resonating with an unshakable determination. These girls are family. We face this together. Clara, her young mind still grappling with the concept of money, chimed in. Aunt Susan, is this because of the money again? Alice, stepping forward, joined her sister. What's best for us is being together. All of us together, even Lucy, though still a little confused, joined her sisters, patting Aunt Susan's arm. We don't want you to be worried all the time, Aunt Susan, she murmured, her voice soft. Maybe Grandma Eleanor is right. Maybe it would be better if we all helped each other. Eleanor watched them, her heart breaking and swelling at the same time. These children, despite their own struggles, were acting as caregivers, trying to alleviate their aunt's burden. Dr. Miller, seeing the shifting dynamics, interjected. The application for the next enrollment period is due in 2 weeks. Eleanor turned to Aunt Susan. What do you need, Susan? What do you need to make this decision? Aunt Susan, tears streaming down her face, looked at Eleanor, a mix of terror and nascent hope in her eyes. I need to know you truly understand, she choked out. The commitment, the months, maybe years, of responsibility, the painful procedures, the setbacks, the need to keep their spirits up. And Alice needs support too. Even though she's not sick, this will affect her. Eleanor knelt down, bringing herself to the girl's eye level. Girls, she said, her voice gentle but firm. If we do this, it's going to be hard sometimes. It's going to be really hard, but we'll face it together. As a family, Alice looked at her, her eyes serious. Will we all stay together? Every single day, Eleanor promised. Clara, her voice small, asked. Even when it's hard? Especially when it's hard? Eleanor replied, her gaze unwavering. Lucy, who had been quiet until now, unexpectedly lunged forward, wrapping her arms tightly around Eleanor's neck. I don't want to get sicker, she whispered, her small body trembling. Eleanor held her close, stroking her hair, a fierce, protective love washing over her. You're not going to get sicker, sweetheart, she whispered back, her voice filled with a promise she intended to keep with every fiber of her being. We're going to fight this thing with everything we have. Later that evening, after the girls had been tucked into bed, dreaming innocent dreams of playgrounds and fairy tales, Eleanor sat across from Aunt Susan at the small, laminate kitchen table. The silence of the bungalow was punctuated only by the distant hum of the refrigerator. Eleanor felt a quiet sense of readiness, knowing there was still more to learn, more of Daniel's hidden life to uncover. Aunt Susan, her hands wrapped around a steaming mug of tea, looked weary but resolute. There's something else you need to know, Eleanor, she began, her voice barely above a whisper. Something Daniel never told you. Abigail, she didn't just die from complications of her condition. Aunt Susan paused, taking a shaky breath. She took her own life. Eleanor felt the air leave her lungs, a gasp catching in her throat. The shock was profound, shattering the fragile sense of order she had begun to piece together. What? She whispered, her mind reeling. She couldn't cope, Aunt Susan explained, her eyes filled with a deep, ancient sorrow. Seeing the girl's early symptoms, knowing she'd passed it on to them, she was terrified. Eleanor, terrified they'd suffer, terrified of what their future held. The girls don't know the full truth, do they? Eleanor asked, her heart aching for the young Abigail and for the children who had lost their mother to such despair. Aunt Susan shook her head. No, they believe she died from complications of her illness. Which is technically true, I suppose. It was the illness that led her there. She looked at Eleanor, her gaze raw. Daniel was devastated. He blamed himself, said he should have seen her depression, should have gotten her more help. A terrible, painful clarity washed over Eleanor. Daniel's burden, his guilt, his desperate need to protect. He was afraid I wouldn't be able to handle it either. Wasn't he? She stated. The realization, a bitter pill. He was afraid of what it would do to me, to know my grandchildren were sick, that their mother had taken her life. Aunt Susan nodded, her eyes glistening. He truly believed you'd lost enough. He thought you didn't need the worry of sick grandchildren. He was trying to protect everyone. Eleanor, you, Abigail's memory, the girls from the truth about their mother, and himself, I think. From further loss, Eleanor leaned back in her chair, the weight of Daniel's secret crushing her. She thought of his years of solitary sacrifice, carrying the weight of Abigail's illness, her death, supporting his children, shielding Eleanor from pain, working extra shifts to cover the burgeoning medical costs. He had been a hero, silently bearing a burden no one should have to carry alone. He was wrong about me, Eleanor stated, her voice firm, tinged with regret for the lost years. I would have helped. I would have helped them all. Aunt Susan reached across the table, placing her hand gently over Eleanor's. I know he was, Eleanor. But he acted out of love, a misguided, desperate love, making hard choices to spare the people you care about. He did his best. Eleanor looked at Aunt Susan, her heart swelling with a mix of grief for Daniel, admiration for Susan's resilience, and fierce love for her granddaughters. I want to proceed, Susan, she said, her voice unwavering. With the treatment program, not out of guilt for what Daniel felt he had to hide, but because those girls, all three of them, deserve every chance at a full, healthy life. And you deserve support. Aunt Susan's face was a mixture of hope and trepidation. You understand what this means, Eleanor. Your life will completely change. From a wealthy widow, living a life of leisure, to a full-time caregiver for 3 children, 2 of whom have serious, progressive medical needs. For months, potentially for years, Eleanor met her gaze, her eyes clear and determined. My life changed the moment I saw them, Susan. The moment I saw Alice, Clara, and Lucy at Daniel's grave. Everything since then has just been figuring out how to make it work, how to be the grandmother they deserve, how to honor Daniel's love. A slow, genuine smile spread across Aunt Susan's face, the first Eleanor had ever seen from her. It softened her tired features, radiating a quiet warmth. Okay, she said, her voice infused with a newfound hope. Let's do it. Let's give those girls the best shot we can. Driving home through the quiet streets, Eleanor's mind was a flurry of plans. The daunting conversations she would need to have with the girls, especially Alice, about the move, the treatment, the disruption to their young lives, the logistics of relocating to Baltimore, the vast, almost unfathomable costs, even with her wealth. But underlying all of it was a profound sense of purpose. Her promise to Lucy, "You're not going to get sicker," echoed in her mind, solidifying her resolve. She would fight for their futures, whatever it took, whatever it cost. The next morning, Eleanor's first call was to Dr. Miller, confirming their intent to submit the application for the Johns Hopkins program immediately. Her second call was to her financial advisor, a brisk, efficient man who was used to Eleanor's carefully planned investments. "Harold," she announced, her voice calm and firm. "We need to reallocate some priorities. I'm going to need immediate access to substantial funds. It's for my granddaughters." Harold, momentarily taken aback, quickly recovered. "Of course, Mrs. Vance. Whatever you need." As Eleanor hung up the phone, a profound sense of purpose settled over her, deeper and more meaningful than anything she had felt since Daniel's death. The void had been filled, not with sorrow, but with the boundless, fierce love of a grandmother. 18 months later, Eleanor stood in the sun-drenched kitchen of their Baltimore house, a vibrant symphony of children's laughter and the sweet, sometimes discordant, strains of piano music filling the air. The grand, lonely silence of her old estate was a distant memory. Here, life pulsed with an energy she hadn't known she was missing. In the adjacent living room, Alice, now nearly 13, patiently guided Lucy, a few steps behind her, through a series of physical therapy exercises, their shared determination a silent language. Lucy, still 11, giggled as she stretched, her movements more fluid, less effortful than they had once been. In the corner, Clara, a blossoming musician, lost herself in the melodies spilling from the grand piano Eleanor had bought her, her fingers dancing across the keys. The treatment program at Johns Hopkins had been intensive, grueling, and at times, utterly exhausting. There were good days, filled with small victories and bursts of hope, and bad days, marked by pain, frustration, and the crushing weight of uncertainty. But they had faced it together. Clara's muscle strength had improved remarkably, her progression significantly slowed. Lucy's journey was more gradual, demanding immense patience and resilience, but her progress had defied even the most pessimistic initial predictions. Both girls, through the unwavering support of their new family, were learning that their condition was a part of them, but it did not define them. Alice, the natural organizer and leader. Clara, the sensitive dreamer. Lucy, the joyful peacemaker. Their individual personalities shone, their dynamic a constant source of joy and occasional chaos. The front door opened and closed, announcing Aunt Susan's return. She walked in, a lighter step to her gait, her face less etched with worry. She now worked at the hospital's patient advocacy office, a position Dr. Miller had helped her secure. It was a role that gave her purpose beyond just caregiving, a chance to help other families navigate the complex medical system. "Aunt Susan," Alice called out, ever the proud reporter. Lucy did all her exercises without complaining, and Clara learned a new piece. Aunt Susan beamed, her eyes crinkling at the corners. "That's wonderful. And guess what? Dr. Miller wants to include you girls in a case study. Your progress has been so remarkable. She thinks it could help other children facing similar challenges." The girls exchanged a silent, knowing look, a deep understanding passing between them. Then Alice, speaking for them all, nodded. "That's important, Aunt Susan, to help other families who might be scared. Like we were." Eleanor watched them, a bittersweet ache in her heart, their maturity, their compassion, their innate understanding of the larger world. It was beautiful. And yet, sometimes she wished they could just be carefree 12-year-olds, untouched by such profound experiences. That evening, as the Baltimore twilight painted the sky in hues of orange and purple, Eleanor and Aunt Susan sat on the front porch swing. "The lease on my old house is ending next month," Aunt Susan mused, her voice thoughtful. "We need to make a decision, Eleanor. Are we staying here, in Baltimore?" Aunt Susan then listed the reasons for staying, a litany of small, vibrant joys. The girls were settled. Alice had made friends. Clara was thriving in a local conservatory program. Lucy had discovered a passion for creative writing and was excelling in her class. Alice was even talking about joining the debate team at her new middle school. Eleanor saw more of Daniel in each of them now. Alice's quiet determination, Clara's intense focus, Lucy's irrepressible optimism. "What do you want, Susan?" Eleanor asked gently, her gaze fixed on the setting sun. Aunt Susan's eyes filled with tears, her voice a whisper. I want to not be afraid anymore, Eleanor. I want to not be carrying this burden alone. Eleanor reached out, taking Aunt Susan's hand in hers, a comforting, familiar gesture. You're not carrying it alone, Susan. Not anymore. You're my family now. Whatever happens, we face it together. Aunt Susan squeezed Eleanor's hand tightly, a silent promise. Then yes, she said, her voice firm. If it's best for the girls, we stay. The next morning, at breakfast, Eleanor put the decision to the girls. Girls, she began, Aunt Susan and I have been talking. Your lease is up soon. We need to decide if we want to make Baltimore our permanent home. Clara, ever practical, asked. Grandma Eleanor, do you miss your old life? Eleanor paused, thinking of the grand, empty house, the quiet solitude. I miss Daniel every single day, she admitted, her voice soft. But no, sweetheart, I don't miss being alone. Lucy, her thoughtful eyes so like Daniel's, looked up at Eleanor. Were you lonely before us? Eleanor met her gaze, a deep truth emerging from her heart. Yes, sweetheart. I was very lonely. She smiled. Now, I wake up excited, with piano recitals and therapy sessions, and homework to help with, and people who need me, and it makes us all less lonely, I think. Then we should definitely stay together, Lucy declared firmly, echoing the sentiment that had brought them all here. Families should stay together. All of us? Clara asked, looking at Aunt Susan for confirmation. Aunt Susan nodded, a loving smile on her face. All of us. I can't think of anything I'd want more, Eleanor said, truly meaning every word. Later that week, Eleanor and Aunt Susan drove to a real estate office. They found a beautiful colonial house with 5 bedrooms, 2 offices, and a dedicated music room, all within walking distance of the hospital. It's expensive, Eleanor, Aunt Susan whispered, looking at the price tag. It's family, Eleanor corrected, a radiant smile on her face. 6 months later, their new home was a vibrant testament to their chosen life. Each room reflected their individual passions. The girls' brightly decorated rooms, Aunt Susan's quiet study where she pored over her patient advocacy classes, Eleanor's sunlit library, filled with books and the hum of a happy household. On Eleanor's nightstand, a small framed photograph sat. Aunt Susan had found it among Daniel's old belongings. It was Daniel, younger, his head thrown back in laughter as he read to his 3 little girls, joy radiating from his face. Eleanor looked at it every night. She finally understood Daniel's protection, his profound secret. It wasn't meant to hurt her, but to spare her a pain he thought unbearable. He was wrong about what she could handle, but he was so profoundly right about how much there was to love. At dinner that evening, amidst the lively argument over pizza toppings, Eleanor felt a complete and utter contentment. The girls had given her purpose, adventure, laughter, and the beautiful family chaos she hadn't known she was missing. Clara and Lucy's medical needs had taught her a deeper, more resilient love for the hard moments. Alice's strength and wisdom constantly inspired her, and Aunt Susan, her weary burden lifted, had become the daughter Eleanor never had. A true partner in this extraordinary chosen family. Lucy interrupted Eleanor's thoughts, her small face peering up at her. You're smiling funny, Grandma Eleanor, she observed. Happy funny. Eleanor simply reached out and squeezed Lucy's hand, her heart overflowing. I was just thinking about how much I love our family. She wished Daniel could see them now. His daughters, thriving, courageous, loyal, getting the care and education they needed, surrounded by unconditional love. She realized that loving them, even with all their challenges, brought more joy and meaning to her life than she had ever thought possible. From a grieving mother, lost in a sea of sorrow, she had become a grandmother with a fierce, unwavering purpose. A future worth looking forward to. 3 little girls whispering bye. Daddy had led her to a new kind of life, infinitely better and richer than the one she'd been living.